Hey guys, what's happening? I am sitting here at my bench looking at what is almost like an East LA body shop because there seems to be nothing but sanding, finishing, and priming going on here for about the last week. I've got this 1/48 scale Airfix Spitfire that's in the middle of it. You can see where I've been doing some work on the joints there. I've got this big hunk of plastic here, which is the Machine & Krieger Falca, and it's been getting the same treatment. And it's been causing me it's been causing two things. One is for my arms to be ridiculously tired from all the work. And the other is it's making me think a lot about primers and the fact that I see a lot of questions about primers on the interwebs and in conversations with other model makers. And I know that a lot of guys have questions about primers. Why should I use them? What are they supposed to do? What's the best primer? All of those things. And those are all good questions, and I've been thinking about making a video about it. And so I decided to tackle that. And this is probably going to be my most ambitious sort of video thing so far, because not only am I going to attempt to cover the subject of primers in some intelligible way, sometimes I do so much dictating on my phone and to my MacBook that I forget. What's really embarrassing is when I do it and when I'm leaving a message on someone's answering service. Anyway, exclamation mark. Where was I? I'm hoping I can cover the subject of primers in some intelligible way that will be useful to you. But I'm also going to try and spray some on camera and do a little bit of a test. So hopefully that will go well and will be worth your time. So let's get started. I have created a list of 10 jobs that I think any good primer should do every day, no questions asked. Before I get into that, let me make it clear up front, though, that I'm not an expert on primer or paint or anything like that. I just, over the years, have done enough of it to pick up some knowledge, and that's what I'm trying to pass on here. So that's how I built this list. All right. So this list goes in no particular order of importance or anything like that. It's just kind of how I thought about it as I was, writing it all down. Okay, the first job that a primer has to do is seal the substrate. Now, this is mostly an issue if the substrate is porous, like say it's a piece of wood, or some of the fillers that we use, Squadron Green in particular, has a tendency to be kind of porous. And what you don't want is for your color coat to soak into that. Otherwise, you don't get the quality of surface finish that you're after. So, a primer should seal the substrate and make sure that you are, in fact, laying your paint down on a smooth, continuous surface. And that gets into item number 2, and that is to provide good traction for the color coat. The thing about paint is that it has stuff in it that does the job of making your object look nice and be protected from the elements. Now, unfortunately, the things that they put in paint to make it do those jobs aren't necessarily the best things to help the paint stick to whatever you're putting it on. And so at some point, somebody had the bright idea of creating a primer, and that's exactly what it does. Priming something means to get it ready or help it along. I mean, if you prime a pump, that's what you're doing. You're helping it along to do its job of pumping water. And a primer is sort of a bridge between the raw surface of your object and the paint, and you put it in between the two to help the paint do its job. And so the paint has to be able to stick to it. It's got to provide good tooth, as painters say. So that is definitely one of the most important jobs that a primer is supposed to do. Now, the other side of that bridge is item number 3, and that is the primer has to adhere tightly to the surface of your object. We know as model makers, especially aircraft model makers, that paint doesn't always want to stick to the surfaces that we want to put it on, especially with these acrylic paints. An acrylic paint, because the solvent is water or alcohol, has no chemical action on a plastic surface. And basically all it is this skin that's stretched around the surface of your model. So it's basically a mechanical bond. Now that's different from a lacquer, for example, that actually sort of melts itself onto the surface. And actually it does have a chemical bond. So we all have direct experience with paint not sticking to the substrate. In real life, there's lots of good examples of it. Aluminum is a really good one. As a rule, paint doesn't stick to aluminum, at least not for very long. That's why, if you've looked at a lot of photographs of Allied aircraft, you see the funky green and yellow colored zinc chromate primers. There was even some pink stuff. The Japanese had a primer called Aotake, which I am undoubtedly not pronouncing correctly, but that's that pretty metallic blue stuff that you sometimes see on the interior surfaces of Japanese aircraft. More normal primers, black, gray primers, we've all seen those. Those are all about getting the paint to stick to the surface of the object itself. And so again, that's a really important function of primer. Now the number 4 thing on my list is that when the primer sticks to that surface, it should do a good job of filling small blemishes and scratches. Those are inevitably going to be there, especially if you had to do some sanding or any other kind of body work. And you'd like for the primer to basically hide all of those so that when you put your color coat on, you don't see a lot of goobers. Anybody who has ever tried to spray all-clad metallics knows exactly what I'm talking about. That stuff will show the tiniest defect in the surface of your model, like it's lit up in neon. So this is a really important function of primer as well. Okay, when it comes to spraying, item number 5, a primer should be dead easy to spray without any kind of modification or thinning. Now, that's not to say that you can't thin a primer. I know some people would argue otherwise, but it's just simply not true. Primer, like any other kind of paint, has things in it that make it do what it's supposed to do. And obviously, if you dilute it enough, it's not going to do those jobs anymore. But that's true of any kind of paint. So it's not a question of whether or not you can thin primer. It's a question of whether or not you should have to, and if you have to, how much do you need to add in order to get it to do whatever it is you need to do. But the bottom line is, if you can thin your primer and still get all 10 of these jobs, or as many of them as you require, done, then go for it. There's nothing inherently wrong with doing that. Okay, when you spray your primer, the number 6 thing it should do is it should dry quickly. Now, look, this goes way back to the fact that primers originally came from body shop guys. And those guys cannot afford to have a car sitting around waiting for the primer to dry before they move on to the next step. I mean, if every minute that a car is sitting there waiting for the primer to dry is a minute that it's just costing those guys money. So they want to be able to move on quickly. Profit may not be such an important motive for us as model makers, but nevertheless, that's part of the benchmark of what a good, true primer should do. Now, one of the things you'd like to be able to move on to quickly is item number 7 on my list, and that is for the primer to allow you to get to sanding within an hour, if you need to do that. Obviously, not everybody needs to do any sanding. I mean, if you are painting figures or armor, maybe, then it's very possible that sanding is not part of your program, and so you don't need that. And so you may not care how well or when or if the primer allows you to do that. But again, that's one of the things that dictates, it's one of the things on the list of what makes a good benchmark primer. Now, when you sand it, item number 8 is it should sand softly and easily. Shouldn't feel hard, it shouldn't fight you, it should dust up pretty quickly, and basically it should just give you a nice feel and help you quickly get to a very smooth finish. And that gets into item number 9 on my list, which is that it should feather well on all sanded edges. It's inevitable when you're doing body work that you're going to sand through the primer at some point, either to the layer of primer below it, to the body filler below it, whatever it is. And what you don't want is to have a jagged, hard edge where you go from the primer over to whatever's next to it, because obviously that's going to show up under your color coat, and as we've said before, that's something that you don't want. Okay, item number 10 on my list is that the primer should be self-leveling and not prone to run. Look, priming should be the simplest paint that you ever spray. It should be about as complicated as a sledgehammer, and you shouldn't be worried about whether or not it's going to lay down smoothly. Because, again, going back to the labor-saving thing, if you get runs and puddles and low spots, that's just more sanding and finishing work that you've got to do before you get to putting on your color coat. And so, obviously, that's would be an undesirable characteristic in a primer. It should go down easy, and it should stay put. Okay, so there's my list of 10 things all explained, but just in case you weren't paying attention, I'm going to go back through the list very quickly. Number 1, seal the substrate. Number 2, provide good traction for the color coat. Number 3, fill small blemishes and scratches. Number 4, adhere tightly to the substrate. Okay, so there you go. That's my list of 10 things with a little bit of explanation. But just in case you weren't paying attention, here's the list one more time. Number 1, seal the substrate. Number 2, provide a good traction for the color coat. Number 3, adhere tightly to the substrate. Number 4, fill small blemishes and scratches. Number 5, be dead easy to spray without a bunch of hassle, like thinning it. Number 6, it should dry quickly. Number 7, you should be able to sand it within an hour. Number 8, it should sand softly and easily. Number 9, it should feather well on all sanded edges. And finally, number 10, it should be easy to spray, self-leveling, and not prone to runs. Okay, so which primer should you use? Well, let's do a little test. I have 3 of them here that I've been through over the last year. One of them is this Vallejo surface primer, which you've all heard of. Now, you've probably immediately noticed that it's pink. I will explain that in a little while. Second is this Badger Stynylrez. Now, both the Badger and the Vallejo are polyurethane acrylics, so they are essentially water-based, and you can use water, standard alcohol-based thinners, whatever, to clean them up. The third one is this All-Clad 309 Microfiller Primer. Now this is a lacquer primer, and so it's pretty nasty, but it's definitely effective. And it represents what I consider to be a true old-school primer. By the way, it's 309 just because it's the black one. They have a gray and a white version as well. So, let's go spray them and then sand them and see what happens. Okay, let's see what we can get done here. I have never attempted to spray any paint on camera before, but hey, there's a first time for everything, so hopefully this won't be too much of a disaster. Alright, now what I've got here is this little Revell Snap Tight F22 that I'm going to use as my test mule for this video segment. And even though it's got some pre-painted sections on it, this is straight out of the box. It hasn't been washed with solvent or soap and water or anything. I've been handling it as I put it together, so basically, you can see it's pretty slick. So it's basically in about the worst possible shape that some plastic could be in prior to spraying some primer on it. Now the first one that I'm going to do, first let me back up. I'll tell you what I'm going to spray with. This is my Iwata Neo, and It's got a 0.35 millimeter needle in it. This has been used a couple of times this week, so it's not the cleanest that it could be, but that's okay. I didn't pick this one for any reason other than the fact that it's what's on the end of the hose right now. I don't tend to use a specific airbrush just for priming. So it is what it is. I mean, these are real world conditions. And the first real world test that I'm going to do is with the All-Clad. Okay, this is the All-Clad 309. It's 309 because it's the black stuff. The other colors, the gray and the white, are different numbers, but this is the All-Clad black primer and micro filler, and as I said before, it is a lacquer primer. It's it's a straight up true primer in every sense of the word that I can think of. And I've already shaken it up, but I'm gonna just go ahead and draw some straight out of the bottle and into the airbrush. And I don't need very much, although I will say that this stuff goes pretty fast. It's quite a bit thinner than the other primers, and it does go through your airbrush pretty quickly. I think, if I remember right, that the last time I used it on a complete model, that it took about half a bottle to cover a 1/32 scale ep54 Mustang, just to give you some, sense of scale. Now, what I'm about to do is terrible practice. I'm not going to turn the fan on because then you won't be able to hear me. And I'm not wearing a mask because then I won't be able to talk. But I'm not going to spray very much of this stuff. We're just, going to quick shot and get it done. I've got my compressor set at about 20 psi, and here we go. Yeah, so much for not turning on the fan. That's not going to work at all. Anyway, as you can see, I just dusted on a light coat, which is the first thing that you always want to do with primer. There's no reason to go, gangbusters and put on a really thick coat. So I've got just a thin, quick, dusty coat there. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit it with the second and probably final coat. Okay, and that really should be enough. There's not a whole lot of reason to hit it any harder than that. But I tell you what I am going to do is I'm going to spray it a little heavier in one area so you can kind of see the difference in the surface finish that you get by doing that. So I'm going to hit this. Horizontal stabilizer right here one more time. Okay, so we've bombed that pretty hard. It's pretty well covered. And just like I was telling you about how fast this stuff gets used up, it took just about all of the 1 mil or so that I put in the cup to do just that little bit of painting. Okay, before I clean the airbrush, I want to take note of what time it is because that's going to figure into what I'm going to do here as I go forward. Okay, so as you can see, not only do I have a Words with Friends notification, but it is 3:33 in the afternoon. And hopefully we'll be tackling this with some sandpaper within the hour so that you can see how that pans out. But now I'm going to go off camera because you don't need to watch me clean the airbrush. Okay, it's a couple of minutes later. I've got the airbrush cleaned, and that was easy. One thing about lacquers is, even though they're nasty, they are extremely easy to clean out of an airbrush because lacquer thinner just takes them right out of there. So that is one nice thing about it. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is this Vallejo surface primer. And I promised that I would tell you why it is not gray, but is in fact pink. This is one of the things I don't like about this Vallejo stuff, is that straight out of the bottle, the gray is so light that it's very difficult to see on a lot of surfaces, and that, to me, defeats one of the purposes of primer. So I added a little bit of red paint to it, just some Vallejo red acrylic. I really did not intend for it to turn out pink. I was, hoping for something a little more manly, but hey, it is what it is. You can damn sure see it. All right, and as you can see, I am just squirting a little bit of it straight into the cup there. So we are loaded up. And by the way, after I flushed the airbrush with lacquer thinner, I did run some UMP cleaner through it, because one thing you don't want is for lacquer to come directly in contact with your acrylics, because it will make a gummy mess, and then you'll have a real problem. Okay, so got some Vallejo surface primer in here, and I'm just going to shoot that real quick right here on this wing. Okay, again, just a quick light coat. I want to put something down that gives the next layer of paint something to hold on to. So again, there's no reason to go crazy right off the bat. You can see that it's drying out even as I'm sitting here talking, and I can go ahead now. I can even dry it off a little bit with the airflow from the airbrush if I want to. It's got that good and dry, so I'm going to go ahead and put a second layer on it. Okay, and that's about enough. You can still faintly see that one insignia through that layer of primer. And that's fine, because really, you shouldn't need a whole lot more than that, unless you're doing some seriously heavy body work. Alright, now that that's down, I'm going to go ahead and clean the airbrush again so that we can get on to the final spray, which is going to be the Badger Stynel Res. Okay, I've got the airbrush cleaned out, not super good, but probably good enough, and I'm ready to go ahead and add a few drops of the Stynel Res. This is actually a restart though, because when I went to do that before, the nozzle of this bottle was clogged up. And you will see, in fact here, let me just squirt out a little drop of it right there. You can see how thick this stuff is. I mean, when you first look at it, in fact, you would think that it was way too thick to even spray, but trust me, it will, even though, look here in comparison, see how much thinner the Vallejo surface primer is? There's a huge difference there, but trust me, you can spray this stuff straight out of the bottle. Even though Badger recommends a 0.4 millimeter needle or bigger, I've seen people do it with the needles as small as 0.2 millimeter. Now, what I do recommend is what I do. I crank the pressure up a little bit. In fact, I generally spray the Badger at around 28 to 30 psi, and that seems to work. Seems to work pretty well so far. All right, so let's go ahead. And I'm just putting a couple of drops in there because you would not believe how far this stuff stretches. For about 30 or 40 bucks, you get 3 bottles that are this size. And you get a gray, a black, and a white. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but the stuff just lasts forever. I guess it's because it's so thick. It just doesn't go through your spray gun very fast. So let's get to it. Let me turn on some air here, and we'll spray this stuff out. Okay, just a quick dust coat. I don't know if you could hear it or not, but the airbrush is struggling a little bit. And that's probably a combination of factors. One, the airbrush is not very clean, and two, it is a little bit of a smaller needle than maybe is ideal for the Stynylrez, and because it's so thick. But it still went down, and here in a second, I'm going to go ahead and spray on another coat. Now, I don't know if you noticed or not, but, and this again is also because it's so much thicker, that I had to make a lot more passes with the Stynylrez than I did with the other stuff. And that's because it's coming out in a much narrower cone, and you don't get nearly as wide of coverage as you do with a thinner material. But it still works good, and we've got that all. I've got all three of those sprayed down pretty quickly and easily, as you saw. And what I'm going to do now is, let's take a quick look at the time. And it is, okay, it's 3:47, so it's been almost 15 minutes since I started. And what I'm going to do now is go off camera, get this airbrush cleaned up, and I'm going to let this sit here for another, say, 30 or 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, so that we've got an hour of drying time approximately on all three of these primers. And then we're going to see what happens when we hit it with a little bit of masking tape and a little bit of sandpaper. So that should be exciting. Okay, well, here we go. We are back, and let's take a look at the time. Okay, it's 4:41, so it's just about an hour since we left this off, and so hopefully this primer has had enough time to dry that we can now tackle the next part of this little experiment. But first, let's get rid of this masking tape. Not really sure why we need to get rid of the masking tape, but it just seems like the right thing to do. So we'll peel that off of there. Okay, there we go. Now, what I have here in my hand is a 240 grit sanding stick that's seen some use. It's not brand new, it's not old. It should be a pretty good real world test with a little bit more light on things of how things will go when we do a little bit of sanding. And I'm going to flip it around to the skinny side here if I can get a grip on the stupid thing. All right. So here we go. First thing I'm going to tackle is some of this all-clad. And I'm just going to sand over here. You can see that I got a lot of overspray from the Vallejo, and I'm just going to sand that off, because why not? Just to say that I can. Alright, so there I've sanded it. You can see it's not thoroughly sanded. Still see some low spots in there. So let's hit it a little bit more. You can see I'm actually starting to sand all the way through it, which I kind of want to do because I want to see how well it feathers. But you can see that one thing it's definitely not doing is peeling off. So let's go ahead and rub on it a little bit harder, because there may be situations where you would in fact sand all the way through it, and that's when that thing about feathering on the edges comes into play. Alright, pretty well feathered. Let's polish it real quick with some 4/0 steel wool just for grins. Okay, you can see that is pretty smooth, pretty feathered. That right there is the benchmark, folks. That's exactly how you want a real primer to behave. I don't know if you can tell from looking at this. I'll get the light in the better spot, but you can see that that this primer actually soaks into the plastic a little bit, and that's one of the benefits of using a lacquer primer. Lacquer thinner is almost a universal solvent, and it actually melts the surface of polystyrene just a little bit, and it causes that bonding that I was talking about earlier. And so, this is exactly what you should expect, is that it's stuck down there, and nothing you do is going to cause it to peel. But speaking of peeling, let's put a piece of tape on it. And let's see if we can yank any of it off. Okay, I'm not doing anything crazy. I'm just putting that piece of tape on there, and now I'm going to pull it off of there in about as violent a way as you ever would, and you should not do it that way. But you can see there isn't a trace of it except for maybe some dust on that piece of tape. So not a whole lot more to say about that. That is exactly what you should expect from a real primer. Okay, now let's move on to the second one that we sprayed, and that is the Vallejo surface primer, this pink stuff here. And now I want to tell you another secret about this bottle of Vallejo surface primer. It's got about 25% future added to it. And the reason that I did that is because, as a lot of people have discovered, Vallejo has a tendency to tear when you sand it. And there are people who say that if you wait, 48 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is, that if you perfectly prep your plastic prior to priming, perfectly prepped plastic prior to priming, say that 5 times fast, by washing it with isopropyl alcohol or whatever, that you won't get the tearing. What I have found is that that's absolutely not true. It doesn't matter what phase of the moon you shoot it in, how you hold your tongue while you're spraying it, or what sort of spells you say while you're doing it. Vallejo has a tendency to tear, and one thing that can help solve that to a degree is by adding some future to it. Exactly why that happens, I'm not going to get into my theories, but the bottom line is that it does work. So let's now see what happens when we go after it with this 240 grit sanding stick an hour after spraying it. And I can tell you that it feels gummy. All right, and you can see there is no sanding going on here. There's just a lot of tearing, and you can even hear that it's different sounding. All right, and when I rub that, I can feel the little balls of it coming off of there. Okay, and you can see that not only is it not sanding, but it's leaving those jagged edges there everywhere that it's getting torn off of that surface. Let's try one more time. Different spot. Same thing. I mean, it's just not sanding. This is just not what you want. From primer. Look. If you don't have to do any sanding, then maybe you'll be okay. But that is, that's just not what you need. Let me see what happens now when we stick a piece of tape to it. Okay, Got that stuck on there. Let's see what happens. Uh-oh, look at that. Now again, I ripped the tape off of there in a very unacceptable way. If you've seen my little video about the proper way to peel masking tape, you know that that's not how you're supposed to do it. So let's put a piece of tape on there and do it in the correct way. All right, and the correct way is to pull the tape parallel to the surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel it back there, and I'm going to slowly pull it. And see how I'm pulling it at a 45-degree angle? That creates a shear force as opposed to a pulling force. All right. So there we go. If I peel it correctly, I'm okay. If I get stupid and just start yanking it off of there, then obviously I'm going to have a problem. Okay, now let's go to the third and final candidate, which is the Stynylrez. Now I want to point something out. Even though it was spitting a little bit when I sprayed it, and it, you might have thought that I might end up with a rough surface, I want you to look and see that that is really a pretty nice smooth surface. I don't have great sensation in my fingertips, but it feels pretty good to me. It's not smooth and a little bit glossy even like this extra triple layer of the All-Clad is, but it's still a very nice surface for having just, blown it on there. Now, let's see how that nice surface stands up to the sanding stick. Look at that. That sounds like it's sanding. And I'm treating it the same as I did the other stuff. Not pushing any harder or any less hard. Okay, now the key thing is that you can see I've got some dust there. That tells you that it's doing what it's supposed to do. It did tear a little bit. You can see there's a few spots there where it did want to start coming loose. And if I push really hard and I dig in with the tip, I can certainly make it. I can make it tear off of there as well. And the thing about it is, with these acrylics that I think everybody should understand is that unlike a lacquer-based primer that's actually bonding to the plastic, the acrylic is basically just creating a skin that is stretched around the surface of your model. It doesn't create any sort of a chemical bond. So whether or not it's going to tear when you go to sand it is going to depend entirely on how tough it is and a little bit, on the thickness. And again, just it's a physical mechanical bond as opposed to a chemical bond. So any acrylic can do this. This Stynylrez is better than anything else I've tried as far as primers go, but as you can see, it's obviously not immune to it either. Let's see what happens when we keep sanding it and see if we can get it to feather out. See what happens when we sand right through it. It's not doing too bad. It's not just ripping completely off of there. Okay, now you can see that it did tear, but hopefully you can tell there that it's feathered out pretty well. The edge is not too. I can't even feel an edge, but again, my fingers aren't that great. But look, watch my fingernail. Okay, I can actually scratch the stuff off of there with my fingernail. And that's again just what I was saying about the fact that it's an acrylic and you've always got that weakness. It's certainly not as easy to scratch off or as rubbery as this Vallejo is. I mean, look, that stuff tears like pantyhose or something. Okay, that's just not good. But then, of course, this lacquer stuff, it's not going anywhere. I will say this, that drying time does make a little bit of difference, as well as does temperature, I think, with this Badger. If I had let this sit here until tomorrow, it definitely would have, I think, performed a little bit better and would not have been even this prone to tearing. Also, if it had been a little bit warmer, it probably also would have done better. The bottom line is it's just got to have all the moisture driven out of it to make sure that it doesn't have any flexibility to it at all. But in spite of the poor conditions that I've placed it under, and tried to get it to perform under, it really hasn't done too bad. It's not on par with a true lacquer primer, but it's still pretty darn impressive, I think. And so I will say that it has become pretty much my go-to primer for most things. Okay, it's a few minutes later, and I just came to the sudden and horrible realization that I forgot to do the tape test on the Stynylrez. So I got so wrapped up in the sanding part of it that I forgot to do that. So let's take a look at that and see what happens. All right, now again, I'm gonna violently yank that off of there, but lo and behold, even when I do it 2-3 times, it still does not tear off, even though it's weakened where I was sanding it. So anyway, I'm glad I remembered to do that, and I also want to say that what I think I'm going to do is leave this here now overnight, and since I was going to finish up this video tomorrow anyway, and tomorrow, after it's all had time to cure out a little bit more, we'll come back with the sanding stick one more time and see if the results are any different. Okay, well, clearly I did not get back to this little experiment within 24 hours because, as you can see, it's actually 48 hours after we last looked at this. But that's even better because now our primers have had even more time to cure, and so we should get a really good test of how they're going to sand out. And so let's get straight to it. Here's the very same Ultimate Modeling Products 240 grit sanding stick, which I love and use all the time. So how does it go? So things are going better, obviously. It's not just ripping itself right off of the surface. And there's a little bit of dust forming that I can see. It doesn't feel like it's really sanding very well. It feels kind of hard and crusty, actually. But obviously it is sanding because you can see that more of that insignia that's under there is starting to show. And there are some little tears there, but nothing major. So let's see if we can get it to feather out. So there you go. It gradually did sand all the way through, which is exactly what I was trying to do. And although it looks like there's a jagged edge there, and I can feel it, so there is a little bit of a jagged edge, and you can see me scraping it off of there with my fingernail. It did definitely sand better than it did the other day, but I'm still here pulling it off with my fingernail. But it's nowhere near as rubbery as it was an hour after I sprayed it. So there's something to be said for that. I should also mention the climate that I'm in. I live in the desert southwest of the United States. And the last 3 days, it's been in the low to mid 80s outside. It's very dry here. We get, like, on a wet year, we get 15 inches of rain for the entire year. So If that gives you some idea of relative humidity, there you go. All right, let's see what happens to the Stynylrez. Just purely from a feel standpoint, it feels to me just like it did when I was working on it an hour after it dried. But it is dusting up a little bit more than it was, and you can see the dust right there. That's exactly what I want to see when I'm sanding a primer. And there's no tearing going on. I've sanded straight through it into the plastic. Let's see if I can get it to feather out a little bit better. It's a little bit hard to see, isn't it, on that gray plastic? I probably should have used the black Stynylrez for this, but I felt like I didn't want to get it confused with the other black stuff over here. That was probably silly, because obviously I know what I sprayed in each place. Let's hit this with some 4/0 steel wool and see what happens. And you can see the dust there from rubbing it with steel wool. And that is definitely smoothed down, and you can see the softness of the edge there, that it's pretty well feathered right there. Now let's do the fingernail test. No dice. I'm unable to tear it off of there with my fingernail. Let's go back over to the Vallejo and see what happens with the steel wool treatment. Guys, I like steel wool. 4/0 steel wool is one of my favorite finishing tools. I know I say it over and over again, but I just think it's worth repeating. It equates to somewhere between an 800 and a 1200 grit sandpaper. But the thing I like about it is that it conforms to irregularities real nicely. This still has a pretty distinct edge that I can feel and tear with my thumbnail. So there you go. I think that about covers it. Okay, gangsters, there you go. If you're still watching, that's the conclusion of my very unscientific and not very exhaustive analysis of primer performance. So, how to answer the questions of what primer I should use. My answer is this. It depends on how many of those 10 jobs you need doing. If you don't need any of those jobs done, and there's, that's a fair position to take, then don't use a primer at all. Zero primer is absolutely the best primer, because the more layers of paint you put on your model, the more hassle it is, the more detail you hide. So again, if you require none of those jobs, then use no primer, and you could probably feel okay about it. Personally, I can't do it. The idea of not using a primer just gives me hives. Maybe that's just old school thinking and habit, but it is what it is, and so I always use a primer. Now, if you only require, say, 4 or 5 of those jobs to be done, in particular the one where you want something to stick your color coat to, and you're not worried about being able to handle it or sand it or do anything like that, then maybe the Vallejo surface primer is in fact good enough for you. I know people who say, that it's great, that they've had no problem with it. I can't agree that it's great. It's like a 4 out of 10 on the scale that I've laid out here. So it's not a good primer. But again, if it's effective for you, that doesn't matter. Use it. Be happy with it. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Now, for me, what's become my go-to primer is the Badger Stynel Res. The bottom line is that it does just about everything on that list of 10, as well as an old school lacquer primer, and without the stank. And I know that that's a major issue for some people. The bottom line is that I can squirt some Stynel Res into any of the airbrushes that I use at a moment's notice and take care of business without a lot of hassle. And so I really like it. Another thing that I really like about it that I think I mentioned before is that it goes a long way. I've got, let's see, this bottle of gray. Give it a little bit of a shake. This bottle of gray is probably, I don't know, I've probably been using it for maybe 4 or 5 months. And I use the gray more than any of the other colors. And I think I'm only down to, it's kind of hard to tell, but I'm only down to about right here. So again, it's kind of expensive if you just look at the absolute cost. But if you look at the mileage that you get out of it, I think it's actually probably cheaper than the other options. So at any rate, there you go. I hope that that answers any questions that you may have had about primers, and that I covered it all effectively. Okay, guys? As always, if you're still paying attention, if you're still here, if you're still in any way informed and entertained, I appreciate you sticking around. And I'll see you next time. Take care. Much love.